Hey Jens.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How you doing? Here we are again. This is like maybe our 15th show.
Yeah, I lost count.
Yeah.
What's this one called?
The Science of Storytelling. So, we've
I
got
don't
an
really
old friend
think of
here.
it as a science, actually, but it really is, and we're going to get into that in a minute.
Yeah, you and I have that craft science creative
debate all
whole
the
debate.
time.
Okay, so let's introduce who's going to be on the show today. We have Patrick Moreau. Hey Patrick, how's it going?
It's going great. Excited to join you guys today and dive into the science and some crazy concepts that I don't think a lot of people have heard about.
Well, that'll be
Okay.
interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and who's our other guest? Anne Hamby.
Hi, good
Hello.
morning. Thanks for having me on. This is an area I'm really passionate about and really excited to talk about.
Terrific.
And of course, we always have Rachel, who's going to feed us some questions from the audience watching.
Rachel.
Hey, Rachel, how's it going?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm the marketing director here at Zacuto, and I'm the one who you chat with when you talk to us on social media. So if you have any questions for our guests or any comments as the show goes on, please put them in the chat, and I will make sure we talk about as many of them as possible. So let's get started.
Thanks.
Patrick, Jens and I don't call it a science. Why do you call it a science?
Because there is a very repeatable nature to it, and there are concepts that when you embrace, you get repeatable results. There's absolutely an art, and you can wrap that in an art. But I was fascinated when I dove into the literature, and which is what led me to Anne, how much the academic world actually studies how storytelling can create behavior change, actions, all kinds of really positive results, and how there's a whole world there of concepts and science that we can embrace and that help us generate or drive more results for our clients and for our films.
So when you say clients, Jens and I were in corporate video for 20 years. We used to call them clients, and we did stories. We had the opportunity to do really nice projects for Jim Beam and other clients like that. But we had these kind of constraints put on us. And in the fashion world, we're like, you got to show 25 garments. There has to be a call to action. These were advertising 101. And let's hear how you feel about that.
Well, I think that kind of that same challenge happens where clients will kind of give you sometimes the bullshit things that you don't necessarily want to get, or they give you suggestions that don't actually help your story, right? The idea that I've got to get 25 garments in a 60-second piece might not be the way we want to kind of move ahead. And so having more of an objective science to go back on and talk about how connecting to a character or how story arc, conflict, how these things actually relate to actions like sales, perceived value, willingness to pay, actual, end results, always seems to really get them to back up a little bit and trust you, right? Because we, as the filmmakers, we want to be the experts. We don't want somebody to tell us how to shoot and where to stand, and we don't want to feel like a tripod. So I love using the science to allow us to have that creative freedom to tell the story that's going to drive the most results.
Looked like Anne was about to say something. Anne, did you have a comment?
I have lots of comments. I guess, the fact that we all agree kind of on what the scientific method is. Okay, well, actually, let me put an asterisk there and say, do we all agree on what science says? If we all agree that, we can reproduce results, if we change one factor and that leads to this reliable, change in some kind of outcome, being able to demonstrate that across different types of contexts, I think that's a very powerful way to come to the table and say, look, you can ask for these types of things, but I can show you vetted by science that there are these other elements that are important if you want these kinds of outcomes that you say you want.
Can I get into it?
Go for it.
So what are the elements that make a good story?
Well,
Stumped ya.
certainly. Wow, I wasn't ready for that one. Conflict is one of the major things, and it's something that as a lot of filmmakers in the non-narrative space shy away from. We're afraid with clients to embrace a challenge, an obstacle, any kind of conflict, but conflict creates engagement. And in the scientific world, that's very closely related to what we call narrative transportation. Which is a really fancy term for that state that we've all experienced, which is just being lost in a story. right? Where you lose a sense of your surroundings. What's really interesting, though, is that experience of getting lost in the story, the science shows that your body is experiencing the same thing as the characters in that story. And that state is highly correlated with behavior change, with beliefs, with action, with all kinds of things. So as storytellers, when we can get people to get lost in our story and fully engaged, there's a ton of positive outcomes that Anne can speak to way better than I can.
Anne, I want to ask you a question. What is the difference between what we're talking about and advertising?
You mean storytelling and advertising?
Yeah.
Is that the question? You can cloak a story. I mean, it can be an ad, right? So I guess I would just say storytelling or the story is more the format of what is being told. So we can have an ad, which is, let's say we've got our objectives, we want to raise awareness, whatever. I can use a more rational, rhetorical, argument-based approach, or I could tell you a story, right? So I think that, yeah, storytelling can fit within advertising very easily.
But you know, when we would work with advertising agencies, there was always, you know, the ultimate goal is to sell something, you know, and they would always pin us into that call to action at the end, you know, demonstration, call to action. These are, you know, we're going back into the 70s and 60s, these, you know, Mad Men style advertising, repetition, you know, speak to these concepts.
I'd just say that telling a good story, like harnessing the power of story, getting people to pay attention, getting people to fall into the message, identify with the characters, that will make those calls to action much more effective. If you want someone to buy a product, tell them a good story that engages their senses and makes them want to buy it, right? So I think these two things are absolutely compatible. In fact, I think, yeah, effective ads are the ones that tell good stories. I know Patrick can speak to that.
I mean, Jens, when I'm thinking about this, you know, and actually, Patrick, when I watched one of your videos, it kind of reminded me a lot of Hal Rainey. I don't know if you guys are familiar with his type of ads that he did in the 80s and 90s, but I mean, like the Reagan ad, Good Morning in America. You remember that?
Yeah,
powerful,
definitely.
man.
Yeah.
That was an incredible ad. Or Pure Michigan. These are, you know, I don't know if you've heard these ads that they do, but I mean, they make you want to cry. And to me, that's like the ultimate ad that you can create.
Well, you're evoking emotion there, and that
Yeah.
people can relate.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of us don't understand, because we like to think that we're super rational. We like to think that we're in control of all of our decisions. We think through them. But the truth is we're far more rationalizing, and emotion is the gateway to action. So moving people is actually how we get them to buy or pay more or donate something, whatever it is we might want. And it's there's a dude that got in a car accident, and he couldn't feel or experience emotions anymore. The doctors thought he was totally fine, but he couldn't experience emotions. Goes home, and within months, his life completely falls apart. Because this guy named Elliot couldn't experience emotions. So what it meant was having turkey or roast beef for lunch took 45 minutes. He couldn't make a decision. Using a pen or a pencil to write would take half an hour. And so as we really dive into it, we see how intricately emotion drives behavior, and then we rationalize on the back end why we did things. And that's where storytelling is really unparalleled in its ability to drive and guide emotions and then connect you to a brand, a cause, a product.
I mean, what you're saying to me doesn't really seem much different than we do in narrative storytelling. Character and conflict obviously are the features. The character's transformation is all part of what we call the formula script, which is what makes the Hollywood model work. I mean, the whole mumblecore movement, which is the sort of the anti-Hollywood formula script model, you know, it works for millennials, not so much for us because we're used to the formula.
Right.
So, I mean, what you're saying doesn't sound much different than the formula to me.
But you're not suggesting
Sure.
that millennials need a different type of storytelling, are you? I mean,
I don't want to
we're
suggest.
all humans.
Yeah,
so.
I personally think that, you know, and we've had this conversation, I don't think that the storytelling process ever changes.
Right.
It's how we process and the emotions, like Patrick said, that we have when we see something. If you have let's look at As Good as It Gets. When he says, "You make me a better man," that is his transformational moment that just makes you want to cry.
Right.
And that's what we watched for that payoff. Anne, how do you feel about that?
What, the idea that there are distinctions, there are not distinctions between some of these things we've made distinctions
Well,
among?
we're calling it a science, but and that's great, but is it really not much different than what we call the formula? Jens and I called it the Hollywood model, the formula, which is, you know, obviously character conflict, transformation.
Well, it's a proven thing. I mean,
it's
like
a proven
you were saying,
model.
you know, and that's when you can repeat it, which they want, so they can make money.
Yeah.
That is a science. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
But I think that's very surface level too, which is what you're kind of suggesting, that like a lot of us know this already. What really the science helps with is what makes for a great character. What qualities can you invariably include that are going to drive connection, right? And that's a much more ambiguous question for a lot of us to answer. We can point out a film like As Good as It Gets and say, yeah, Jack Nicklaus was a great character, but what actually made the audience connect with him? And what's fascinating is as you dive into the research, there are actual character qualities, traits that lead to stronger connection. And same with conflict, there's motivations and types of obstacles that actually will drive more connection and more engagement than others. And so it's creating more definition and more clarity around how do we actually, and what does it mean to even have a strong character?
what does that mean? What are those traits?
Yeah. I want to hear those.
Two big things are desire and motivation, right? And it's not necessarily what they want, but it's how much they want it. So the more somebody wants something, the more we want it for them, which leads to empathy. And we've all had, you know, experiences where you see kids wanting candy or a toy, and you know they don't need it, but they want it so bad that if you're not their parent, you want it for them. And we feel the same way. And I realized this in my wedding days, very true, when like it didn't matter how gorgeous the wedding was, how big the budget was. If the couple didn't give a shit, then I couldn't make you care. And vice versa, you could have the lowest budget and shoot on your iPhone, but if the couple had a crazy desire and they really wanted something, then all of a sudden I could get you as the audience to care. And the same is true of motivation. Why does somebody actually want something inside the story? And there's some really fascinating research about certain kinds of motivations that are far more effective than other ones.
Anne, I want to give you a second to chime in here.
Sure. Let me jump back to comment, and then I'll jump directly off of what Patrick said. I did want to make a comment about this arbitrary distinction between the worlds of fact and fiction, and the fact that we oftentimes think about fictional stories, Hollywood stories. Maybe that's what you meant more by the formula, I'm not sure. And then, you know, an advertisement where we are selling something and we're potentially talking about someone's real world experience. I think we're trained to see those two as different, but in fact, these story principles, like you guys are saying, it's all still a story. And there's research that shows that I can tell you that something really happened or didn't. It's a fictional story, and it doesn't make a difference in terms of how people process it and how people are persuaded, which is kind of crazy, right? Like, we're accepting that something is fake in a sense, it's fictional, and yet we come to believe some of the things suggested by the story. Let me give you an example. If I tell you a story about a psychiatric patient who gets let out of a psych ward, goes to the mall, starts stabbing people, you know, and you know out of the gate that this is literary fiction. It doesn't matter. People will still be more likely to endorse policies about prohibiting the freedoms of psychiatric patients, even though they could tell you that, yeah, that was a fictional story. They still are influenced. Their beliefs are influenced. So I think that's one thing where it's hard for us to wrap our heads around, the fact that, you know, oh, it's just a story. It's, you know, that has no influence on me, and yet absolutely does. So there's that. And then jumping off of what Patrick was saying about different types of character motivations, we are able to, just like we're able to try to interpret what the people around us, why they want what they want, and we make judgments about that. If a character wants to do something for what we see as more noble motives, more noble reasons, so, you know, they want to make the world a better place, or, you know, they're trying to persevere through some sort of deep challenge, we're more likely to buy into what that character is about, to want to root for that character, than if the character is motivated by what we would call more nefarious nefarious motives, wanting to hurt someone, or have motives that are kind of ideologically inconsistent with our own personal motives. So, we've got people on different sides of the political aisle here that tend to align with different values and different reasons for action. And if you see a character who's acting in the way that you see as good, you're more likely to you let yourself be persuaded by that story. You buy into the characterizations for action.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Jens and I weren't suggesting that there is a difference between these stories. We're actually saying that they're the same. I mean, the whole idea is to move people. And like you said, Patrick, if you don't care about the character, and I personally don't mind if the character's evil or good. You can be very compassionate to an evil character. You can feel bad for him. Go on, Ann.
I was going to say, but how are you judging evil? Are you judging based on their actions or their motives? What makes a character evil in your mind?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he that like Batman, the Green Hornet, because he's considered to be the bad guy, but in reality, he's actually a good guy. But he's sort of like we don't totally know. He kind of runs the line there, but I find him very intriguing because typically we think he's a good guy.
Yeah.
So.
And just raising the question of, we can call like a Dexter type character like a bad guy, right? But when we think about the underlying reasons why he does things, it's for the overall, creating a just society or kind of like righting wrongs. So I guess I just wanted to raise the point that when we think about evil characters, if we look at their underlying motivations, maybe their motivations are actually a little bit more good, and then that's sort of what drives our ability to empathize with them and root for them. But I think that you also raise a valid point. Sometimes we're just curious about how people will turn out. Are they good? Are they bad? And that pulls us in too.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up another interesting point, which is about, and it's something that Jens and I have talked about, where, documentaries, we get people on here who do weddings. I think that that's one of the greatest stories you can ever tell. And you brought that up, Patrick, and I have a wedding background. I think that we've talked about this. And you learn so much by doing that one-take environment. But more than that, like you said, the kinds of projects that you and Joe and Shahinian did were just astounding. I mean, you could watch them and you could cry with these people and you don't even know these people. And
without words necessarily.
Yeah, that's your whole thing.
Well,
no words.
Stories can be told obviously without words.
Three of my
cavemen were doing it.
Exactly, and 3 of my favorite internet pieces ever, 2 of them don't have a single word in it. I talk about them all the time. That video, 1,000 Words by Dan Chung and Carlos.
Dan Chung.
No, not Dan Chung.
Right.
Ted Chung.
Yes.
But Dan, you're great.
Yes.
We love you too. And Carlos Loscano's A Love Story in Animation. I mean, you'll cry if you watch these pieces. They tell an actual story through just the looks in these people's faces. And it is a full story with 0 words.
And in a short amount of time, which some people say can't be done.
Yeah, that's even the more incredible thing.
Didn't have enough time to tell a full story, but that's not necessarily true.
What do you think about that? What do you think about telling stories and never saying a word?
I think that there's a misconception that a lot of our meaning comes through in the words we say, but the majority of our communication is nonverbal, is everything else. And so I think it's something like 70, 80%. So I totally see that. And, talking about weddings and why those can be so powerful, if we looked at the formula that you talked about, you've got people who are experiencing heightened emotion and a transformation. And so, it is a recipe for something that has the potential to move people when you embrace, storytelling principles, because you've got that kind of place. And there's nothing about the idea of developing character or conflict and transformation that requires language or a language that we speak, because we can see people experiencing those things and connect so deeply with it without a word being spoken.
And you want to
And I would
in.
say from all the cognitive science, the cognitive psychology on stories and story processing, Actually, even the stories with words, we have to shade in the gaps. We have to make what are known as inferences to figure out, how the person got literally from point A to point B. Like if I tell you that this character is going to a grocery store, in order to build this mentally, we have to impute some kind of goal. She's going because she needs to buy food, right? So that's not given in the story, and there are other more consequential things that we have to impute. But so it's even when there are elements present, in order for us to mentally understand and build this model out of a story, we have to do all kinds of background work that we bring to the table from our processing of prior stories. So absolutely, telling a story without words, I think it's just a series of imputations based on facial expressions and some of these deeper things, like Patrick said, the emotions, that are expressed via other, I guess, languages that are not verbal.
Yeah, go on, Patrick.
The other side of that is that a lot of times we don't put thought into any kind of structure or into saying anything, or really just why the audience would even care, and then we can make more montages or music videos that don't have any reason for us to keep watching. So I think, we can do that without words. We always have to be thinking about our audience and how are we actually connecting them to what's being said, whether we're using language or visuals or just seeing people, whatever that is. Because it's a very slippery slope to go the other way, where you can't watch more than 10 seconds of something because it's random visuals to with flashy effects and a soundtrack.
We talked about character and conflict, and those are, obviously without conflict, you have nothing. I have a script doctor that I work with, and I often drop pages on him of different, because we're working on several narrative projects, and he just, even though we think we have conflict, he's like, no, he goes, I don't buy that scene. He goes, if you do a love scene, he goes, I need to see conflict there. It's like, there's something in there that's not exactly perfect. But I want to move back to a third component that's the one that's my pet peeve one, which is transformation, or what I call revelation. In other words, some stories, people just, you're sitting there till you get to page 75, and I'm going to a narrative form because it's just easier to talk about. And all of a sudden, you're like, the story just ends. And you watch that and you're like, oh man, I just put, at that point, 65 minutes into this thing and it just ends. It's like, where's my payoff? It's like, I'll sit there with my kid and we'll watch something where like, they just stole our time. That is wrong. Now, to me, this transformation, which is the part, the cry part, where you feel like, okay, I've waited this time, this character's learned and he's changed. Or the one that I like the least, which is the revelation, where it's not as satisfying. He doesn't change or she change, and you kind of realize that it just, life sucks for that person. How do you, we haven't really talked much about that. How about you go first, Dan?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if this is exactly the direction you wanted to take it, but working on a research project right now in the context of entrepreneurial stories, entrepreneurship stories, and founder stories. So in more of like a traditional business sense, we hear that we should tell our failure stories, right? Tell people how you fell flat on your face, and that's kind of counterintuitive, but plays into this idea of transformation, where okay, I learned, and now I'm better, right? Buy from me. And in fact, if you take a character and have them fail and then transform, become better, learn something meaningful, and that's the key point here. You've got to learn some sort of deeper more meaningful lesson about what it means to be human, or what it means what are the important things in life, versus something that's more trivial. Then I'm more likely as a consumer to want to buy that company's product, to invest in that entrepreneur, to donate to that nonprofit, versus if that character started out as good all along, right? Like not a lot of change, but just kind of already had these lessons under their wing. So there's something about what the studies are showing is that when we see the transformation in the character, we as the audience experience something known as moral elevation. So we are lifted up and we think about, oh wow, the good in humanity, or what is possible in humanity. And there's something special about that emotional state that makes us more likely to want to give away our resources.
I mean, to me, that is the emotional state. It's like prior to that, like Patrick and you both said, character and conflict is great. You know, we're like, okay, you know, you sort of get into the story, and sometimes there's just like exposition. I'm like, okay, already, you know, our attention spans are weaker now. It's like I watch a 70s movie and I'm like, my God, this exposition is going on forever here. Let's just show me the conflict, lay out the story, and let me know what I'm getting into here.
And then you want to see the payoff. You want to see them achieve what they want to achieve, right? And that's where you said you were let down before?
Well, I get let down all the time, you know, it's like, but regardless, I think viewers, yes, they need to either have some kind of resolution or some kind of transformation.
Why do you think some of these don't have that? Do you think it's because they want you to figure it out in your own head and make your own ending? And is that a good idea? Maybe that's a question for them.
I'm going to ask Ann, because I mean, you know, we're talking a little more narratively, and which is kind of weird because our background literally is we've done 1,000 corporate videos, you know. So, and we didn't have all this science. We just used what we knew that worked, you know, and we tried to create, you know. We tried to have good characters. We tried to show conflict, although in the 80s and 90s, people really weren't that into that. And we tried to move people is what we did. We just tried to make them emotional. When we did stories for Jim Beam and we were interviewing his grandson and whatnot, and he would say, my grandfather would be proud of me because I've carried on this tradition. And that moved people, and there's, you know, that's how we did it. We just didn't have words to put onto it like you do, Ann.
So I think, is the question more along the lines of, is it good to have the ending and have some kind of closure, or is that someone commenting
well,
on?
It's more of a comment.
I guess I'll comment on that.
Yeah.
I think in general, people do want to have some sort of closure, some sort of ending, some sort of payoff in order to just bring it full circle. Otherwise, it's still kind of open-ended, and there is all kinds of research showing that we don't like ambiguity, we don't like open-endedness, and we do want there to be some sort of point. I would say, though, a caveat is, what are your goals with the story that you're telling? Right? If you if the goal is to entertain, we can end it a certain way. We can end it in a happy way. If your goal is to get your audience to think more, if you do want to stimulate reflection, there are certain types of endings that are going to engender that, and maybe more of an open-ended can do that. But you have to know if your audience is capable of that and motivated sufficiently to do that. Ending on sort of a sad note, I would say, is one way to, assuming that you are tying in some of these themes that relate to these broader, more important life types of lessons, that's one way to get people to continue to reflect on it. But yeah, so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your message, right? Know your audience and know your objectives.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, like, let's talk about political ads. Sometimes they're meant to anger you. Sometimes they're meant to... That's actually one of the most interesting projects you could get, because your assignment isn't necessarily benevolent. And we've had that situation, Jens and I. We had for a while been kind of doing these videos where we were kind of said, we want this person to say this, you know, a celebrity or something. We want them to say this. And it wasn't exactly benevolent, but it did evoke a response. So, you know, what about political ads? That's sort of an interesting way to go.
Political ads in terms of the stories that are told, yeah, absolutely. I would say
stories.
that we see a lot of storytelling, particularly in politics, because they do rankle the emotions. So, you know, you can see decontextualized fact statistics about, you know, what politician X has done or has not done, and people just kind of go, yeah. But you see an individual's concrete experience about, you know, social injustice, or how you know, coming from the other side, you know, all this regulation has stymied a small entrepreneur's ability to develop their business, and you identify with that, right? Like you can put yourself in those shoes, and you experience that anger. And actually, anger, if we look at the appraisal theory of emotions, so different types of emotions have different types of effects. Sadness makes us less likely to act. maybe more likely to reflect, but anger moves us, it arouses us to act. And we can also have that on the positive side too. So contentment is a relatively low arousal emotion. You know, I feel gratified, that was fun, whereas more of the exciting, upbeat type of emotions, those are going to be more likely to drive people to action. So yeah, I guess with political ads and political stories, you want to engender these emotions that are very, very arousing.
And I want to apologize for one sec, and because I didn't let people know what it is you do, it just kind of occurred to me. Why don't you tell people what it is you do so they can understand who you are?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Hofstra University. So, and I'm interested in persuasion. So it's interesting how I've come to this idea of storytelling, looking at it from the persuasion lens. And most of the research in my field has really ignored storytelling, shockingly, as a means to persuasion. It's really focused on the hard sell, the rational pitch. But then, as Patrick mentioned earlier, all the recent science in the past decade or so is coming around and illustrating time and time again, we're not rational, we're not as persuaded by ration, we're emotional, intuitive beings. And so understanding some of these ways that stories tug at our emotion it's just good business sense, honestly.
Well, we're really glad that you're with us here, because this is sort of way out of our realm, and it's great that our viewers get to hear this from a scientific point of view, or from a research point of view, I want to say. So I want to do this. I want to roll a clip of yours, Patrick, and you can, before we roll the clip, why don't you tell people a little bit about your background, and then we'll take a look at the clip and we can talk a little about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I started as a wedding filmmaker that was really just interested in exploring documentaries. But it was because people were connecting with our wedding so much that it led to a relationship with Canon, a wedding that went viral, a 200-day NFL contract because they'd seen a wedding film that we did. And then that led to a documentary that won a bunch of Emmys, all from wedding films. And so what we're showing here is a piece we did for CBS where really the idea was, can you make a story about how a football is made? And now a lot of us could approach that. You could go down, this is right in the year of Deflategate, you could go down and you could just show how footballs are made, and it's going to be a little bit of a snooze fest, or people that like football will watch it, but nobody else. And so what we had to do was find a real-life character that you could connect with and find real-life conflict in that. And so what I love about this around the topic of science and storytelling is we found such an unlikely character, this 60-year-old Aunt Jane who's made footballs for 50 years. And when we watch the piece, we can talk about how the conflict and that kind of transformation, seeing what she experiences, can connect people that don't even really care about football or how they're made. So it's an interesting exploration in how you can find character and develop conflict to make something far more powerful.
Fantastic. Let's run that clip.
In a town you've never heard of is a lady you've never met.
Football was my job. I always wanted to make it. And especially when I got to sew in the NFL ball. That football's out there on that field, and millions of people are seeing that football that I sewed. I want it to look good.
Every football that has ever been passed from one NFL great to another has come out of small Ada, Ohio. For the past 48 years, Aunt Jane has had a hand in every Super Bowl football since the tradition began. And this was her last year.
I see my work, or saw my work out on the field, but it just doesn't seem real. If I could just walk out on the field, and just, because I've been in the stands, but to see what it looks like, the stadium from the field itself on the 50-yard line or something or other, I don't think it's something that can happen because I've retired.
She has been part of a community built on a legacy of hard work and loyalty, clocking in each day at Wilson's factory. It starts with 4 panels that come together, delicately stitched inside out by time-worn hands. Hands like these. Hands like Aunt Jane's.
That's pride. It's a pride thing, selling the footballs for the NFL, of being able to do that and meeting all the people that I have met. It's something that I didn't want to give up.
But 48 years and tens of thousands of footballs later, these hands have put down the stitching needle and clocked out. Aunt Jane sews up the last Super Bowl footballs of her career, passing them off to the NFL greats.
When a player makes a big play and he keeps that ball, and I'm thinking, my football is in somebody's trophy room somewhere. That is their trophy that I made.
No one in the world will have done what you've done, and no one's a better teammate or more loved by your partners.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
She walks out of the factory and onto a plane to Phoenix. She's headed to see her 10th championship game. Aunt Jane has been there so many times, but she's always been so far away from that field.
So the one thing that we haven't been able to do that Wilson has been wanting to do for you forever, and one thing that I know that you've wanted to do is you wanted to get on the field at the Super Bowl. Well, today's the day. So we're going to take you onto the field.
Thank you so much.
For nearly 50 years, Aunt Jane went into the factory with the same precision, dedication, and tenacity found every day on the field.
Oh my. We're at the stadium where the Super Bowl is going to be played, and I'm on the 50-yard line. It's awesome. It's a dream come true. Never thought in the world.
Her expert stitches are her contribution to something bigger than her, bigger than Ada.
Nice.
Yeah, it was real nice, man. Good job.
Mm-hmm. You hit all the marks.
Yeah. My only wish is that she could have been there during the actual game. That would have been amazing.
What? We had that cleared. We had her switched, and she was going to carry out the game ball on Super Bowl, like at the morning of the game. But it was some kind of kids group that was supposed to do it that she'd be taking the ball from, and she's like, I won't do that. So we had to go in the day before because she didn't want to take it away from the kid, which is
wow.
Yeah.
From a story standpoint, so sad, but you totally get it.
That's an interesting footnote.
So neither of you have seen this Morning in America ad. I mean, we're a little too old for this now. The Reagan Morning in America. All right, Rachel, put that in the comments. A link to that because.
Does she have any questions, by the way?
Yeah, let's go to Rachel for a minute.
Actually, if you guys would let me have a question, when we were talking about political ads earlier, it reminded me of the PowerPoint that you guys sent earlier about the getting a viewer lost in a story can sometimes help avoid counter arguments. And I thought that point in general was really interesting, and I wanted to hear a little more about it. But that sounds like, in particular, when it comes to political ads, that would be a particularly good technique. Can you guys talk about that a little more? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think, when we go with a traditional kind of a commercial approach, when you tell somebody how to think, what to do, automatically we resist, right? We think of counter arguments, we think of how we believe, and we're processing it rationally. But what happens in a story is that idea of narrative transportation. When you get lost in a story, you are experiencing it as if you are in that world. And so you're not actually trying to come up with counter arguments. You're not trying to figure out why this is wrong or why you don't believe this. You're actually just experiencing it. And what is so powerful is that whether it is true or not, you experience it as real. Your body goes through the same emotions. Your brain experiences the same things, which is why telling a strong story, regardless of whether it's true or not, can be so effective at persuasion. And is so dangerous in the political sphere. We can see things that we know are not true, and we can wonder why they can be so powerful to a certain group of people. But when you can tell that strong story, the truth doesn't matter.
Anne, I want to ask you a question. When, going with what Patrick said, when you have buy-in, in other words, if the person resists the story and you don't get this buy-in, how does that affect their ability to get the outcome of what whoever it is who's paying you for this story wants?
Was that for me?
Yes, for you.
Sorry about that. So the question is if people don't get into the story, if they're not transported into the story, then what? Then,
I mean, yeah, we would call it buy-in. That's what we used to say. So Patrick just said that if they're not if they don't get lost in the story, then at that point, to me, I would think you're not getting buy-in. And, and then how does that affect the outcome of whatever the purchase, I would call it?
They turn you out.
Yeah, maybe.
That's why this idea of transportation is so critical, because, right, if you fail to transport the person, if you fail to get them to care about the story, if they don't enter into this story world, then yeah, it's going to be much less effective. There are tons of studies showing that if you can get people to suspend their disbelief, enter this world of the story, it renders their persuasion defense radar sort of null and void, and then you can play with their beliefs and attitudes and intentions. But yeah, if you don't transport them, then you're not going to be able to, as much as companies would like to, as much as individuals who have vested interest in persuasion would like to. No, that's the ultimate thing, resisting the transportation into the story. I did want to jump off the counter argument comment, though. There's the reason why we don't counter argue against stories. So I can give you the political ad with all the facts, and we're primed when we get that type of message. We're basically lawyers trained to start defending against, what is this? What are they trying to do to me? How are they trying to change my beliefs? In the context of stories, because they are so gratifying, it would, generating these counter arguments, what it would do is it would bring us out of that transportation state. And it's really just a selfish, we want to enjoy the story. We like getting immersed into stories, and so we're less motivated to generate counter arguments. And so that's in part just from the cognitive side why this all works so well.
Got it. Sounds good. Yeah. Rachel, did that answer your question? And do we have any questions from the audience?
That did answer my question. Thank you. We had a question about humor, because a lot of these, like the corporate videos and the particular, there was like a wave of them that came from sort of like healthcare ads that were all looking to get people to cry. They were all tearjerkers. But do these techniques work as well when it comes to trying to get people to laugh?
And
wait, what's the question?
How do you use humor to get a response out of people? Is it as effective as crying?
I'll jump in and say, if you can evoke a hedonic response, so you make people feel good, positive emotions, it depends on your objectives, right? So gratuitous humor for gratuitous humor's sake, no. So, we see these Geico ads where they're kind of funny because there's these non sequiturs, a sloth doing whatever it is, bingo, or, there doesn't really connect to any kind of message. If it's in the service of a message, if you laugh and it's connected to whatever that persuasion-related outcome, that action you want to get people to take, if there's a logical connection there, possibly. Making people feel good, evoking happiness, evoking positive emotions, yeah, that can be effective, but if it's in the service of driving the action.
Jens, this was an amazing show today, and what's unique about it is that we've never really looked at stories in this way.
Yeah, as a science, right?
Yeah. We look at them, and I think we're doing the same thing, but we're just not using the same words. So I want to thank Patrick and Ann. This was a really terrific show, and I think it's going to really help a lot of people when they're trying to do the same basic things that have been going on since the beginning of time, including the Bible or any story you want to look at, which is really the Bible. My God, talk about character, conflict, transformation.
Shakespeare.
Exactly. But thank you very much for joining us today, and we really had a great time. This was a terrific show.
If people want to learn more, they can go to Patrick's school, right, and the site?
Yeah. Patrick, why don't you tell us a little bit about that before we sign off, about your school and site?
Yeah, so we're Muse Storytelling, and we have a film school that takes 30 participants around the world to basically learn these concepts that Ann and I are talking about, but you have to find, develop, and create a story in some random place in the world, like Okinawa, Japan, or Iceland. And the whole challenge is, can you find a character, can you develop the story, and then can you go with a team of 5 other filmmakers and bring it to life in a matter of days? And so it's the ultimate experiential challenge to not just learn the ideas, but actually go into a very challenging environment and pull the ideas out and create something that is a powerful story, to really set you up for success as a filmmaker, to be able to go into that boring, client piece and find a powerful story that you actually care about and that can drive results for your clients.
Amazing.
Yeah. Rachel, we'll let you wrap this out.
Okay. Thank you to our guests, and thank you everybody for watching, and a big thank you to ICANN, who provide all of the lighting for our show. On next week's show, we will be talking about the craft of wedding filmmaking, so make sure you join us then. We'll be back next Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.